Hi, I'm Alex Augustiniak, co-host of the Positively Geared podcast, and joined in the studio across me with Lloyd Edge, the host. Lloyd, great to be back in the studio. It's been a little while.
Alex, it's great to be back. It's been a few months. A lot of things have changed since we last spoke, and really keen to have a chat on where we are at the moment.
So let's start with Buy Now, your second book. It's probably just tipping over 12 months, maybe a little longer since that book release. How's it all going?
Yeah, Alex, it's done really well. So as you say, it's just over 12 months. It's become a bestseller as well, selling really well through bookshops and across Amazon. And generally, very well received. It is a little bit different to Positively Geared. It offers a few different strategies that I didn't mention in my first book, talking a lot more about things like renovation and also strategies, in fact, 2 or 3 chapters on how to buy your own home and things like that, and how to search the best streets and to get the best value, things that people often haven't perhaps thought about themselves. That's been quite well received, and I've had a lot of feedback from people who have taken the book, read it, and it's actually helped them to go and purchase a property, or they might have reached out to me and my team for a little bit of help. But yeah, I'm quite overwhelmed with how well it's done, and at the end of the day, I really just wrote it to get the message out there, to let people know that if I can do it, so can you, and here's some strategies that you can use, and been really pleased with the way it's going.
And I think, Lloyd, that it's no small feat to be able to produce 2 really high quality books within, a relatively short period of time. The writer's block sounds like it hasn't kicked in yet, which is great. How do you keep yourself motivated to keep producing this great content? And what do you think is next on the horizon in this space?
Well, I think in terms of how I keep myself motivated, it really is a love of property, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a love of property itself from a tangible point of view, but the way it is as a vehicle to achieve your goals moving forward. I love talking about property, but I love sharing my ideas with people. And I think that's really what keeps me going. And even these days when I do a fair bit of media and I get asked to comment on what's happening in the markets and put out articles and things, I love putting out that content for people to read and everything like that. But I guess the other thing that keeps me going is don't really sleep much at night, right? So I've always got something to do in the middle of the night, and I'm one of those really early birds that's awake early. I'll work hard during the day, I'll get home, and then I'll fall asleep really early, put the kids in bed, and then I'll fall asleep. And my wife's always hassling me about that. But after she goes to bed, I kind of wake up, and then the rest of the night is like, oh, what am I going to do? So that's when the brain sometimes kicks into gear and things like that. In terms of what's next, look, for me, it really comes down to just helping people and putting things out. The publishers have asked me to write a 3rd book. I haven't actually committed to that or anything at this stage. However, it could be on the horizon. But just putting out content and giving people that sort of advice that can help them to achieve their own goals moving forward.
Sounds like you've been really busy. And it's probably a good segue. We're currently here in our recording studio. We're coming to the end of 2023, which is very, very scary to say. The time goes so quickly. What would you say, let's maybe look back retrospectively from when you were putting the final touches on Buy Now to its release. What have we seen in the market since then? A lot has changed. Where do you kind of see ourselves at right this instant now at a really high level?
Well, that's a really good question, because Buy Now was released in May of 22. Obviously wrote the book through 2021, and it's back then when we had really low interest rates. People had a 2 in front of the interest rates, and we had the Reserve Bank governor basically promising that interest rates would not be increased until 2024. Then all of a sudden, we've had all these interest rate increases of about 13 of them that have finally been put on hold. We've had, as of now, we've had about 3 consecutive months of them being put on hold. But so many increases have put a lot of people under financial pressure and things, and people have had to think about their cost of living and how they can manage their finances and things. But one of the biggest things is I'm always talking about positively geared property and how to find those kind of assets. That gets harder depending on how people borrow, how they leverage on a property, and the interest rates they have. So instead of having a 2 in front of the interest rate, it might be a 6 now. So that's been a bit more of a challenge, but it's still doable because we are still finding good cash flow properties for people. So that hasn't actually changed, but where we buy has. And like with anything, and I can go right back to when I first started investing myself, where I'm always trying to get ahead of the market, trying to find the best place to invest. Still doing that now, but looking at what people's strategies are, what they need for yields, and what it has meant for Oz Property Professionals as a business and for the way I operate things is that we're now licensed in every state in Australia and the ACT. So we used to be fairly eccentric on the East Coast and sort of mainly bought in New South Wales and Queensland. We now buy everywhere. And it does mean that depending on people's budgets, if their budgets have gone down a little bit because their serviceability is lower because of interest rates, we're able to look at these other areas with higher yields around the country, and it's been really good for outcome.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I mean, we've spoke about this in the past, but why is it so important to be able to differentiate between different markets? And I think what we mean by that is, if you treat one region of Sydney with the same brush as the rest of the country, it makes it really hard to make investing decisions. And I think also too, it can put you into a state of overwhelm, particularly if you're an inexperienced investor, because it's kind of like, where do I start? What do I do? What is the right place to buy? And I mean, even to this very day, with everything that we've kind of seen happen in the market, it's not unusual on a weekend you'll be having a lunch with some friends or a drink and, Alex, Lloyd, you should check out this area. This area is looking really promising at the moment for XYZ reasons. How would you help some of our first-time listeners or even some of our longer listeners that might be just wanting to take a pulse check on their strategy right now? How would you suggest that they approach the current market space? And I guess to be very specific, what things don't change? What variables don't change that can help people make better buying decisions?
Well, I think the variables that don't change are essentially things like, you want to buy in an area that has, a lot of drivers. So whether it's a suburb in a major city or whether it's a regional area, look for multiple industries. So things like retail, manufacturing, education, healthcare. You want to stay away from areas that are just driven by, say, mining, because if that collapses, then we have heard what happens to those sort of markets. So those sort of things generally don't change. And also the type of property you buy isn't going to change. And I have often talked about investment grade properties. So something that's well located, that is in, say, a quiet street, maybe a cul-de-sac in a school catchment zone, that's going to be a much better asset and perform better than something that might be on a busy road, in a flight path, under or in a flood zone and all those sort of things. So those things don't change. So that's something that you really do need to look at. But also in terms of where we are in the markets, you do need to look at what your strategy is. And that's why I always talk about strategy, because what is a good property for one person to buy may not be a good property for someone else. So we can say, Alex, that property over there in DY is a good property, but it doesn't mean it's a good property for both of us to buy. It might be a good property for you, but I might be looking for something that has better cash flow, or my budget may not be as high. So those sort of things are really important to look at. And that's why we do need to look more abroad than just around where we might live.
I think one thing really resonates with me, Lloyd, just listening to you, and it probably sound like broken records by now if someone's binge listening our podcast. They're going to say, not again, Alex, but strategy. Like, it's super key. And I think the hardest part for even experienced investors, but also first-time investors, is a strategy is not necessarily always an end goal. The end goal is the end goal, but the strategy is what gets you to that place. And obviously, over time, you may need to pivot depending on what the market's doing. And also taking a pulse check on, is your strategy from 2 years ago still aligned to what's going to get you to where you want to be in 5 or 10 years' time?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Alex. And I think definitely we do need to differentiate that a strategy and a goal are not the same thing. So a goal is where you want to be. So in 10 years' time, I want to retire from work, or I want to have $100,000 in passive income, or I just want to be able to pay for my kids' school fees and whatever the case may be. A strategy is how you're going to get there. Now, it's also not possible to just outline 10 years of properties you're going to buy with your strategy right now. So you can't just come and have a meeting with me and say, okay, here's your strategy for 10 years, because no one can forecast exactly what you're going to buy. The markets change, the finances change. So no mortgage broker or bank is going to be able to forecast what you can borrow, next year or the year after. So we need to keep revisiting that. And it's also really important, as you say, to do a pulse check all the time. And when I meet with my clients after they've bought a property, we catch up 3 months after that purchase, and then again 3 months after that, to revisit strategy, to talk about what the markets are doing, and to look at what they can do next. And maybe you do need to pivot. And when interest rates and things change, sometimes people get really stressed and worried, but there's usually solutions around that. But that's why you need to be really open around that and be open for that change.
I think open is a real key word there. Openness comes in a variety of ways. I think once you do have a trusted advisor or somebody that you can confide in. We talk about having a dream team. I think it's really important to be able to have those transparent conversations with them and say, Lloyd, this is my situation. These are my concerns. What could be a next step? There's always more than one next step, but I think being able to be open allows the channel of advice that comes back to the investor to significantly increase too.
That's exactly right, Alex. And I've had a few situations like that where I've helped people buy property at low interest rates and they were positively geared. Then they might have been a little bit negative cash flow because interest rates went up so much and people getting stressed. And of course, people's first reaction was, well, this property was meant to be positively geared. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball and we can't always plan for exactly what's going to happen. But we do need to look at property and the goals as a long-term proposition. And although no one really forecast how much interest rates would increase, there's still ways around that. And going back to what you mentioned about the dream team, that's where we then will also involve the mortgage broker in that conversation and say, what can we do about this? Can we refinance? Will the bank offer a better rate? Is there another bank that will offer a better rate? Because even if you get a 0.5 percentage point reduction or something like that, that can save you quite a bit of money per month. So there are ways around that. And then, and even things like you might have bought an old property and the cash flow is not so great. Is there a strategy there that we can add value, do a renovation, do a subdivision? It's always talking about it. There's ways forward.
So I think, looking back at the last 12 to 18 months, let's say, it's probably, I think, a good opportunity to give some insight to our listeners around being kind of in the captain's chair, for lack of a better term. You've worked really hard to build a loyal customer base over the years, and without doubt new customers would come to you all the time. How do you block out the noise? How do you kind of pivot in terms of developing plans for customers at work, putting the media hype to the side, putting things like there's an interest rate cliff about to happen, there's supply chain delays, or the building industry is about to go belly up, or XYZ. And, while there's definitely some degree of truth to possibly all those statements, it doesn't necessitate that it's all doom and gloom and let's not bother doing anything because it's all too hard. How do you, before you develop a plan to a customer, work out what's true and what's most important? What's the Northern Star that guides you to help people make better decisions with investing?
Look, for me, it comes down to experience. So, someone who's maybe been doing it for 1 or 2 years hasn't really had the experience, and then they might be swept away with what the media says, or they might be just trying to be really salesy and marketing and say, oh, no, that's not going to happen or whatever. I've been buying property for 20 years now, and I've seen quite a few ebbs and flows. And, I was buying and stuff through the GFC and things like that. So I've seen stuff happen in the past, and I certainly know that things that we hear in the media, things that economists predict, often don't really make much sense. I've learned to block that out and not be scared of that, and just to use a rational mindset. Having said that, people do have their, they're a bit scared of that and hear things like that. So, and I respect all that. I need to talk people through that. And there are times that, that we've pivoted because during the pandemic, we were seeing construction prices increase a lot. There were supply chain delays. And while I have people coming to me to build duplexes at that particular time, I was actually suggesting to them, I don't think you should do this for this reason. Not because I was worried about builders going broke, because I'm very confident with my builders. We haven't had that issue, touch wood or anything like that. But it's more about the actual industry, the supply chain delays, whether your project would actually be finished on time or go longer, and whether there will be any variations put on there because builders were, not doing fixed price contracts at the time and things like that. So I'd suggest to people, buy an established property. Let's subdivide, make some equity. And I was doing things like that. So pivoting, and people are much more comfortable with that approach. So it is really looking at people's risk profile and what's happening in the industry, and then looking at other options as well. So for me, it's definitely about listening and understanding about what people want, what motivates them, what scares them, but then having a good conversation around what I think can happen, what I think will not happen, but also having a good reason behind that. But a lot of that is my experience for what I've seen over the years, and things like property prices crashing and mortgage cliffs. We're hearing about the mortgage cliff. We've been hearing about that all year, and apparently it still hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen at the end of the year or something. So there's a lot of clickbait and stuff that goes on in media.
And I mean, if we can just unpack that for a second, purely for my own guilty pleasure, interest rates. I try and avoid the mainstream news these days. If you turn it on for 2 seconds, on 7 or 9 years, Philip Lowe's become a bit of a famous name in all Australians' households. What do you see? A purely speculative view. Do you think that we will see further increases? We look at kind of the last few quarterly CPI reporting. Where do you see things going?
Yeah, so I keep track of the inflation and the CPI reporting and stuff like that, and we've seen inflation coming down. And, when we did start to see interest rates put on hold, I had actually predicted each of those times that would be put on hold. So I was fairly on the money from that. Now, I've also been sort of telling people that I think sometime next year, probably in the back half of next year, we might start to see interest rates, start to come down as well. But that's obviously a bit speculative. And also it really depends on what's happening in the markets. Only on the news this morning, all of a sudden we're hearing that the RBA might increase interest rates again before the end of the year because getting at that mortgage cliff, that hasn't happened yet. And so there's more, more talk around that. But that was not in the media last week, so that's something that happened today. So for me, I don't think at this stage that'll happen, but I do think that we're on hold at the moment and be on hold for a while, and eventually we'll start to come back down. But I still urge people to look at property investing as a long-term alternative. I know that some people will get into a bit of financial difficulty when interest rates go up so much and things like that. But in general, I think people will need to be careful not to be too scared of the hype. And if you're getting in to start buying a property, just make sure it's the right move for you. If you're buying a home, probably buying something that's sort of well under your budget there, so you can afford interest rate increases and things like that. If you're buying an investment, let's focus on that cash flow a little bit more. And if you used to think, I'll be happy to have a negatively geared property, maybe focus on the cash flow a little bit more, might help you make a good decision.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, you would know that when you apply for a home loan, the bank is going to measure your income versus what they believe that you can comfortably repay. And we should be diligent to exercise a similar approach whereby if you're adamant that this property that you purchase needs to be income producing, whether that's $50 net or XYZ, it could be due to not be currently able to service that mortgage out of your own pocket. There's 1,000 different reasons why you may move towards that style of purchase. Do the math. If we treat every single city or region in Australia as its own market, the opportunities are there. And if you do take that time to be super diligent with your numbers and say, okay, well, let's say that interest rates do go up XYZ, 2%, 3%, 4%. Where does that leave me? What's my financial position on this property? Is it costing me money to hold, or is it still producing me money to hold? And then kind of build from there. Is that a thought process that you ever implement?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And it's also important to note that banks do have their assessment rate, which is generally 3% above the interest rate they're actually lending you. So if they're lending you 6%, they're assessing whether you can borrow money on 9%. Now, that means people's serviceability is going down. So, some people can borrow less than what they might have been able to buy, 6-12 months ago as interest rates have gone up. And that surprises some people. But when you understand why that's the case and how that works, it makes a little bit more sense. But I think it's really important to do the math around all that. The other thing I urge people to think about is how they're leveraging the property and how they're financing it with their repayments. If you are looking for something that's positively geared, if you're looking to, say, borrow 80% of the property's value and then you're using equity from somewhere else, which is essentially a loan as well, and then you're wanting to sort of positively gear or have a cash flow positive property based on 100% on lending, that's very hard to achieve. So that's a little bit different than if you're using sort of a cash deposit and you're borrowing 80%, leveraging 80% and getting rent that'll cover the repayments at 80% is much easier. So people sort of need to understand the best way to work that out. And in the higher interest rates, it does get harder to, fully positively gear something on really high interest rates. And they're the sort of strategy things that I can talk through people with. The other thing also is some people want to do positively geared, but also do principal and interest repayments, which is kind of counterproductive really, because when you pay principal and interest, you're actually paying more repayments per month. So you're making yourself pay more, but then you want to have positively geared as well. So if you want to reduce your repayments for the time being, then probably go interest only and get some advice, obviously, from your accountant, from your broker around that. But that might be a good way to set up things, at least for a couple of properties with interest only. Certainly the way I grew my portfolio. Over the long term, it can affect your serviceability by going interest only too much. So that's why finance strategy is really important. And it comes back to having a dream team and the right broker who can give you some advice on that as well. But it's not as simple as just saying, let's have principal and interest, because then you can start paying down the property as well. Because part of my strategies are that you'll have an exit plan eventually where you'll sell some properties that have appreciated in value, and that'll help you pay off some other debt. So you don't really need to look at paying off your first investment property you're buying just by payments through your wages. if you pay interest only and you just rely on the capital growth, and then there'll be other strategies in place to be able to pay that off later. So that's why the overall long-term plan of what you're trying to achieve is really important.
Yeah, it's very, very true, Lloyd. And I think those investing principles, a lot's changed since I think we recorded our first episode of this series. And, those principles still very much reign true to today. I'm going to ask you selfishly, what do you think the opportunities will be in the next 12 months? And opportunity can come in different ways. What do you see as not a hack, but maybe a quick way or something that can... Because we know there's no quick ways, by the way, to build wealth through property. It's quite the opposite. But what is something that we can kind of plant a seed with our listeners today to perhaps pick up and look into further?
I think something we've always talked about, but adding value to a property. So if you can find something that might be the ugly duckling, the worst house in the best street scenario, and do a bit of a renovation. Now, for some people that could be slightly structural, or it might even be something like you got a 3-bedroom house, you're going to put an extra bedroom in there or something like that. For a lot of people, it might be just a cosmetic renovation, but if you can do paint work, do the floor coverings, maybe in the kitchen you might have old laminate bench tops, you could replace them with some stone bench tops and put a new splashback in, a bit of landscaping on the outside. That'll go wonders to increasing the value of the property, but also increasing the cash flow. So if you're struggling to get the cash flow you want on a property, just finding something a bit cheaper, and at that cheaper price point, the yield tends to be better anyway. But then if you are able to add some value to it, that'll increase the cash flow on it. I think that's a good hack. In terms of location, there's a few areas around the country, I think, that lend themselves to having better yields than others. But we've got to keep in mind we want strong locations that aren't too focused on just one region. When thinking more abroad, I mean, Western Australia, South Australia, and Southeast Queensland that offer good yields as well. So if you're someone who wants to invest close to home because you live in Melbourne or you live in Sydney or Newcastle, yields aren't very good. You really need to sort of really be a little bit more borderless about that as well, because I think that's a good hack to have in mind as well.
Yeah, some sage words there, Lloyd. And, what you said about looking to buy a property that may need some more work, I think that's sacred advice. And I think it's very underrated advice, despite what the market might be doing. And look, we could possibly use the building, the supply chain delays argument as a reason to maybe not look at that strategy at the minute. But I've found, generally speaking, over my career, that buying that worst property on the best street, if you're open-minded and comfortable and are prepared to put a bit more skin in the game in terms of getting your hands dirty, it can always yield good results. You kind of look at the interesting social studies. I would say that probably 8 or 9 in 10 home purchases, we're talking about mum and dad home purchases, not necessarily investors just looking for a property to move into. They want the house with all the bells and whistles. They don't want to do the work. Just being able to be that 1 in 10, and these are completely made up stats, by the way, so don't hold me to it. Just being able to be that 1 in 10, I think, already puts you at an advantage, because there's margins there. There's that instant equity that you can unlock pretty quickly if you make the right moves.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's a lot to be said for you being able to do some of the work yourself. If it's possible for you to get to the property, it might be just by fortunate circumstance. If you're buying a property in Queensland and you live in Brisbane and you buy in regional Queensland, you might be able to get there, for example. But if you're able to maybe do the painting yourself, it'll save you $5,000 from having a painter. So automatically that gives you a cost saving there. And then you might just need to get a plumber or a sparky to do other stuff. But there's a few strategies around also in terms of how busy tradies are. So you're not really going to find a property today and then have someone coming in next week or straight after settlement necessarily to renovate it for you. So one thing that I like to do is, have tenants in the property for maybe 6 months, and maybe you might buy a property that's already got tenants in place either on a lease or an expired lease. But you can use that time while they're in the property to actually line up some tradies and say, I need this work done on the property. Can you guys do this in 6 months' time? And you can kind of book them in. Sometimes you can't really book them in for exact dates, but a lot of them, if you sort of do a bit of networking there, you can book them in, and then you can vacate the tenants and get some work done then. And that is a way of mitigating against there being, tradies being too busy to do any work for you or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so true. And as you build your dream team, as you build those relationships, you find, the plumber you can trust, the sparky you can trust. It's going to be a lot easier because you can have those conversations ahead of time. You might bring the plumber out or the sparky out to the property or your builder before, auction day, for example, or before you put an offer on it. And you can kind of develop a plan a way forward well ahead of waiting till settlement day to then see who you can book in to do work. I think another point just to kind of close off this topic is, depending on the market you're buying in, it'll likely affect the kind of work you may or may want to do in terms of improving a property. I mean, if we're buying in an area where we just want to make it clean and presentable to attract a good tenant, that could be a short to medium term option, right? Until you've got the ability to then look at more comprehensive developments. Do you find that that changes over the lifespan of a property tenure?
It can, yeah, absolutely. But I think the more important thing to focus on there is just making sure you're not overcapitalizing. So look at what you're buying. And this does come down on top of property buying, your location, which is also reflective of your budget a lot of the time. So, if you've got $300,000 to spend, it's going to be different to buying a multi-million-dollar property somewhere. But when you do renovate something, renovate to the demographics. Someone in a country town, they live sort of simple lives. They may not want to have flashy downlights and 40 mil stone bench tops and 900 mil appliances in the kitchen and all sorts of things that are going to be more expensive. But something that's really presentable, that's painted, it's got some nice floating floors and some nice curtains, and it could work well and be much cheaper. So you definitely don't want to overcapitalize, because then that sort of property won't sell for what you want to sell it for, because it's kind of in the wrong market. So just keep that in mind. You're not going to buy a really cheap property and then think you can sell it for millions in that market. It's about trying to get decent equity gain there, and as I often say, trying to get $3 for every $1 you spend is a reasonable outcome. So like I often say, sort of spend about 5% of a property's purchase price on renovation. So if you buy property for $400,000, 5% of that will be $20,000. So if you spend around $20,000, give or take, 5 to 7%, $20,000 to $25,000 thereabouts, and then you can get 3 times that much back. So your property might then maybe be revalued at $460,000, $470,000, $480,000 there, that sort of mark after the renovation. Then that essentially gives you the deposit for another property, and that's how you use that property to leverage into another property. So you've got to think in realistic terms. It's about building wealth gradually in properties, and if you do that successfully over a number of properties, then you can do really well.
Yeah, that's very helpful. We thought we'd share a little bit of a future outlook in terms of what we've got planned. We've got some really exciting guests coming up. We've had a good lineup of different guests from totally different backgrounds, with one core commonality, which is either a passion for property, having invested, or wanting to invest in property. So we're really excited, Lloyd. We've got some really cool guests in the pipeline, once again, from all different walks of life. We really want to just take this opportunity to let our listeners know, stay tuned, and there's some good things on the horizon.
Yeah, definitely. No, looking forward to it. Can't wait. So yeah, stay tuned. Yep.
And Lloyd, the other thing that's been brewing in my head is, I'm sure there are people listening to our podcast right now. So if you're listening to our podcast right now, for example, and you're interested in a specific topic, you might say, well, that's very interesting what Lloyd said. I'd love to unpack that a little bit more. Or, Alex and Lloyd, you haven't covered X, Y, Z. We would really love the opportunity for you to reach out and share that information with us, so that we can devote some time to talking about that between the two of us, and possibly even if you might have questions that would be relevant to any of our future guests, which we can't reveal too much right now. So
that's great. And I think like when I wrote Buy Now, when I knew I was going to write that book, I actually put out a post and asked people to let me know what they want me to include in the book. And I got really good response about that. And some of those chapters and some of the information was sort of based around people's responses. So when we've already asked that question around our podcast, I mean, you and I just sort of sit here and just have a bit of a chat, and sometimes we get off track, sometimes we're on track, and have a bit of fun. So hopefully people are enjoying it. However, be really keen to hear from people if there's certain things that they would like covered. Even if there's certain guests I'd like to have on, we might be able to try to get something like that. But feel free to reach out. You can drop us a line at our website. It's ozpropertyprofessionals.com.au. Keen to hear from people, and just hope everyone's enjoying it.
And Lloyd, on behalf of the two of us, we'll be back in the studio soon. So we thank everybody for their time today, whether you're listening to this in the car or hopefully maybe on a nice exotic island on holidays, because the weather's not great here today in Sydney. But thank you very much for your time. And Lloyd, likewise, looking forward to sitting here with you very soon.
Great. Thanks, Alex.